Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video from the RPA Vanguard channel. My name is Andy Menon. Today, we are going to get into the world of Linux robots. And the focus of today's video is going to be one of the prerequisites that is required before you can build and deploy Linux robots to your UiPath infrastructure. And that prerequisite is the Docker environment. So let's get started. So before we begin, I have a few points to clarify. First off, this is not a full-blown course on Docker, right? Rather, this is a discussion on Docker in the context of UiPath Linux robots. And therefore, the target audience are those who are familiar with UiPath, but who are also getting started with Docker for the first time. Or you might be revisiting Docker after a while, such as myself. So this video covers what is minimally required for you to get a Docker container up and running on your Windows 10 machine before you deploy and run your first Linux robot. Now, the steps are easy, but they are elaborate, right? And where possible, I have captured the output of these steps when I ran them on my machine to get Docker set up, right? And I'm going to share them with you, right? And when you watch those steps in this video, hopefully that will make your journey in the Docker installation process a lot easier. So this video will also cover the initial part of Docker's getting started tutorial, right? There are a couple of excellent getting started tutorials on Docker's own website, right? But I'll be covering the initial part with the intention of helping you create your first Docker image and then running it on your Docker installation. So that way, what happens is you have enough confidence in your installation before you build and host your first Linux robot, right? Your UiPath Linux robot. And then it is not to be forgotten, a huge call out to UiPath Academy course on Linux robot, plus also their documentation page. But if you aren't familiar with Docker, you will most likely run into trouble if you haven't read the documentation fully, or you start with their course as the first step, right? Because the course makes it very clear that you must be familiar with Docker, and then the UiPath's Docker image must be already installed on your computer, right? So this video aims to clear all of that so that you can be on your way to building, hosting, and running UiPath Linux robots in your UiPath orchestrator, right? So with that, let's get started with how to install Docker on your machine. So to get started with installing Docker, the first step you have to take is to get to this page, right? You get to docs.docker.com, get-docker, right? And when you get to this page, obviously you have to click on the link that corresponds to your flavor of the operating system. This video assumes that you're running Windows 10. So when you navigate to this link here, it's going to take you to this page. And here you can see the system requirements for WSL. WSL is Windows Subsystem for Linux. And then there is a list of requirements that your system must satisfy in order to have WSL installed as part of this setup, right? So once you have gotten past that, the next step for you to do is to download Docker Desktop for Windows, and then click on the installer once it completes downloading on your system, right? And Docker Desktop for Windows will install itself as any other Windows program. And once it installs, you have to restart your system. Once you have already completed the system restart and start Docker from your start programs on your Windows desktop, what happens is the Docker UI opens up, right? And what you will be seeing on the Docker for Windows UI is not what you see on the screen here. There will be some error that will be actually posted on a blank screen, and this dialog pops up, right? And what this dialog is communicating is that the Visual Linux kernel is installed, but you will need to actually apply a patch by going to this link. And when you click on this link, it will take you to this page here. Note that it starts from step 4, right? And this link is to download an update package for machines running Windows with x64 architecture, right? And if your architecture, system architecture is different, then the instructions are different. But this video assumes that your machines have x64 architecture. So when you click on this link, it will download another installer on your machine, and it will be named Visual Updates for x64. As usual, you click on it and you allow it to install itself, right? Once you complete the installation, the next step for you is to set up your Visual as your default version. So what this step 5 says is set up the Windows subsystem for Linux 2 as your default version. So for that, you copy the command you see here, open up PowerShell. Now, as far as I recall, I opened up PowerShell in the admin mode and ran that command in PowerShell admin. And if that command executes successfully, right, you will get this output, right? And the last step here is for you to go back to this dialog and then hit the restart button. Now, once you hit restart, what happens is Docker for Windows restarts. And this time, there will be a prompt for you to actually run a command, right? A Docker command at your command prompt and come back to the screen, right? And that is where we segue ourselves into the Docker getting started tutorials, right? And this is where you actually start working with Docker in order to get some familiarity with what you need to know before you start hosting and running your Linux robots. And this is the Docker get started page. And this is where you start at part 1, getting started. And this is the command that the Docker desktop for Windows will prompt you to run at the command prompt, right? So what you're going to do next is to actually copy this command and run it at your Windows command line. Now, a brief mention about the Docker desktop that you see here. I have many number of containers already sitting here ready to run, and I have actually persisted them here because I know what they do. But you might most likely see nothing, and you will have only one container running when you execute that run command. So what we'll be doing is we go back, copy this command and paste, and we hit run. Remember that it is going to take a few seconds and you will get back a long identifier. You really do not need this. It merely says that the Docker run command has been successful. Very briefly, what it is telling you is that if you look at the explanation of this command, is that you are running the Docker run command in a detached mode, right? That's what the -D is for. And what the -P or -P 8080 means is it is taking the port 80 on your host machine, the machine which is your Windows machine, and mapping it to the Docker container, right? Port 80 of the Docker container. And then it is giving this container a user-friendly name. And the user-friendly name obviously is getting started, right? So once that command line has executed successfully here, you come back to your Docker desktop and you will see a container actually running in your Docker desktop for Windows, right? And it will have a funny name, right? They are all random funny names, but that is of very little consequence here right now. What you would want to be doing next is click somewhere on this highlighted bar here. And when you click here, you will see a bunch of logs, right? And one of the things that you have to remember is that these logs will be removed once you stop the container, right? They do not persist beyond the lifetime of the container, right? And if you want to inspect what this container is about, you go to the inspect menu item, and it tells you what this container is about. Now here, this is a very simple container. All it tells you is that it has taken port 80 on your machine, and it has mapped it to port 80 of this container. And the status here says it is running on your computer, right? So you go to the browser, localhost, and then you hit enter. And here we are. This is the Docker Labs getting started application. Now, the beauty of this whole thing is that this getting started web application is a tutorial for you to actually build your own Docker image and spin up another container. And that's why I said that these two tutorials on Docker are really excellent, because they really have a beautiful way of actually walking you through how to get familiar with Docker, right? So once you bring up this page on your browser, this is the same page that we saw here in the Docker documentation, right? This is the same page. Right. So we are back to the local host getting started web application that is actually running inside of container here in Docker, right? And what we do next is click on our application. So once you come to this page, it talks about what you will be building, as part of the exercise to get your first Docker image up and running, right? And that application is going to be a TODOs application. And as part of the first step, you will come down here and download the zip file. Now you can go back to the Docker full documentation and download the file from GitHub, right? Or the link that's provided on that page. But the problem with that is it comes with a lot of other things that you do not need. It's a distraction, right? Especially if you're starting out for the first time with Docker. So what I would recommend is download this zip file, because this zip file, as shown in this graphic here or this image here, has the minimal number of things that you need, just the bare minimum number of things that you need to spin up your first Docker image. Okay, so what you do is you download the zip, and then you unzip it to a convenient location on your computer. One of the other things that I highly recommend is for you to get started with Visual Studio Code, because this is a great opportunity if you haven't already done that. And what I have done for the purposes of this demo is I have downloaded this zip again, and I have put it into another folder named C:\users public Docker demo, right? And we'll be working inside the app folder. So this hierarchy of the path to the app folder is immaterial, right? And I have Visual Studio Code. So what I'll be doing is I will be opening up that folder in Visual Studio Code. So I copy this path. Obviously, you have to grant Visual Studio Code the trust. So basically, this is a trusted source. So click on the trust button. Here you can see that the Visual Studio Code Explorer shows that you are in the app folder, and you need to be in this folder because you have to operate in the same folder as package.json. And the next step for us is to generate the Docker file, right? So if we go back to our tutorial app, this is where we start building the container image. And for that, you have to generate a Docker file. Now, one of the great things about Visual Studio Code is that you can generate a file without a file extension, right? Because the specialty of Docker file is it must not have an extension, right? If you have a generic text editor, then it has a tendency to add the .txt extension. And therefore, you must take care that if you're using a different editor, that you don't have any kind of extension to your Docker file. And also remember, it is not just Docker, it is Docker file. Because the way we say Docker file, it makes it look like it is a file with the name Docker, right? It's not, it is Docker file. So what we do next is we just copy this, go back to Visual Studio Code, and remember you are in the same folder as package.json, right? And what you do is you click on new file and you paste Docker file here. And you can see that Visual Studio Code is smart enough to show the Docker icon next to that file, and the file has no extension, right? And going back to the tutorial app, we copy this, the contents of this window here. And here is a copy link. I'm going to copy that and then paste that here. So each line means something here. This is a bare minimum, and a Docker file obviously extends much beyond this, but every line here means something. And if you go back to this tutorial app, right, it actually gives you the entire description of what this code does. What we'll be doing next is actually building this Docker image. And this is the command for you to get started. But also to note is that there is a dot in the end, right? And that dot indicates to Docker that it has to look for a Docker file. We go back to the command prompt to the same path where your app folder is located. So first we copy this path, and then we go to command prompt and we change directories to this path. And we come back to our tutorial app. We copy this link and we paste, right? Now, I'm not going to run this command here because it is going to take a while before it completes, right? And I've already run it, and there is a Docker container on my machine that's actually running. So what I'll do is I'll skip this step, but if you have followed your steps correctly, as per this tutorial, when you hit run on this command, you will see this image being built, right? And once this image is built, the next step is for us to start the app container. Again, here there is a command, the Docker run command. And then what it is telling you is, again, the D and P flags. We are running the containers in detached mode, and we are mapping the port 3000 on this Windows machine with the port 3000 of the container, right? So this time, so we'll copy this command, and this image is already on my machine, so I can run it, right? So I can run the Docker container. I'll wipe this out, and I'm going to paste this here, and I'm going to run it. Again, there's a long ID. That means your command has run successfully. And if I go back to the list of containers, here you can see that there is a second getting started container running, right? And this is running on port 3000. So obviously, we go back to our browser and we access localhost 3000. And if you have reached up to this point in your journey, congratulations, because you have installed Docker Desktop for Windows. You've done it correctly. And then you have built your first image, Docker image, and then run it successfully as a Docker container, right? And if you want to go one step further, you can simply test this, right? And I'm going to add a few items. And if you want to sort of strike off each item on your to-do list, that's pretty much the process that you have to go through in order to install the Docker desktop for Windows on your computer. That is all for this video. I hope you learned something new, and I definitely hope that you like the content of this video. And if you did, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I'll truly appreciate it. Thank you, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.